Hello, I'm Anita Diamond reporting for 4ZZZ Brisbane Line News and Current Affairs program. And today I'm speaking with filmmaker, author, musician, and activist Peter Joseph about his global nonprofit sustainability advocacy group, the Zeitgeist Movement, and all things related to sustainability, the economy, human rights, and the way forward for human civilization. Welcome, Peter, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me, Anita.
Now, for context, you were the director of the Zeitgeist film series, which is a three-part independent documentary film series, which, to quote the Zeitgeist website, seeks to describe who we are, how we relate, what we're doing, and what we should be doing if we wish to live in a peaceful, humane, sustainable, and healthy global society. And I wanted to ask, can you explain then what the Zeitgeist movement is all about?
I'll start with the film series just to be clear. The Zeitgeist film series began kind of inadvertently with an experimental performance art piece in 2007, which today is kind of the oddball of the entire series. It was created more as a sociological shock piece than a documentary I did in my spare time. And believe it or not, it was never intended to be released to the public. But when it was inadvertently uploaded to the internet for whatever reason, as I did not promote it, it exploded and it captured the zeitgeist, no pun intended. And from there, I was like, well, I have some public attention now, even though it was inadvertent, and I certainly wasn't intending on being a filmmaker in reality or even an activist to the degree that I am now. I decided if I'm going to have to do something a little bit more important here. So I thought about what really concerns me when I look at the world, and economics and sociology came to the surface. So then the second film came along called Zeitgeist Addendum, the sequel. It came out the next year, and it went into this territory, building the argument that if we're going to be concerned about anything right now on this planet, we really need to understand how things are working, particularly how our economy is working, how we are responding to it, the sociology of this system, procedures, incentives, and ultimately the system dynamics, if you will, of what is going on in this machine. So then the third of the series came out in 2011 called Zeitgeist Moving Forward, which continued this exploration. But it was Zeitgeist Addendum that inspired the Zeitgeist movement. It was kind of an experimental thing to throw out there at the end of the film. And we started building chapter structures, and it all kind of peaked around 2013, 2014. We had about 1,000 chapters in 70 countries. There was a lot of activity. Thousands and thousands of events have been conducted with the movement, even though you won't hear much about it in mainstream dialogue. But it's been a unique ride as a kind of, well, disorganized grassroots, but decentralized and extremely prolific organization. So in short, the Zeitgeist Movement is a global sustainability advocacy organization, as general as that sounds. It takes a big picture view, realizing that without some pretty radical and fundamental economic changes to the way the world works, everything that activists are doing really isn't going to achieve much as we battle it out within the traditional political structures and whatnot. We have to think far more big picture, and that is basically the educational imperative of the movement. Now, I'll conclude that by saying if anyone wants to learn more about it, there's a book that was written called The Zeitgeist Movement Defined. It can be purchased in paperback, which is nonprofit, but you can also download the full PDF at thezeitgeistmovement.com.
Yes, thank you. That was very useful. And I'm sure there's a lot that we can talk about with the films, but I guess, as you said, they were centered around what our current social political system is based on, which is monetary market economics. And I wondered why. Can you explain why you chose to center on this or what you see as the fundamental problems with the current economic system?
Well, as I briefly touched upon just a moment ago, simply the analysis of the market system is so critical, what we vaguely call capitalism. And within this, we realize the source of two of the most destabilizing forces we're experiencing today, which is socioeconomic inequality and environmental destruction. And the realization is that both of these outcomes are endogenous to the system, meaning they are built-in outcomes. And as time has moved forward and as, environmental conditions has changed, as civilization has progressed, particularly with population increases and rapid technological advances, which can, it changes the temperament of society when you have completely different mechanisms organizing. For example, the rise of automation is challenging labor for income. What's going to happen when robots replace people? How does capitalism deal with that? Can we still have capitalism and so forth? But more broadly, all these problems of inequality and environmental destabilization are getting worse. Anyone paying attention to the news today should see that, and they ask why. And that's the radical revelation, is that it's coming from the actual system. It's not a moral or ethical issue. This system is creating behaviors and incentives. And the traditional attempt, as I touched upon prior, to counter these outcomes is, of course, politics. This is where 99% of activists on one level or another are engaging, whether it's NPOs or lobbying. And the prevailing assumption is that, well, we're going to find ways to use our government and our general interests to regulate these features. This is what's implied. This isn't what people will say, but this is what we're doing, actually. We're trying to regulate the endogenous features that are negative. We're trying to say have wealth redistribution to stop income inequality. We're trying to say have stricter regulations for, environmental laws, strict regulations for environmental laws, and so forth. And we assume that's going to work. And what another unfortunate realization is, because believe me, I wish that did work, what's becoming increasingly clear is that these forces have become so powerful in this evolution that the traditional regulatory attempts are really no longer effective. And this is the new level that we are at in this adaptation as a civilization. Once again, the cultural and most specifically the power problems that are consequential to market economics are of such force that any attempt to move against it and correct these negative market externalities, as we'll talk about in a moment, quickly get countered. They quickly get diffused by generally special interests that have something to gain, that want to hold on to their power and wealth. And as another side, you have a general propagandized culture. There's a lot of social fear out there. People even to this day, when they hear about somebody talking in criticism of capitalism, they say, "Oh, well, you mean you want socialism and communism?" Like, this is the kind of polarity and ignorance, for lack of a better expression, that we are faced with. So, as radical as it is, my perspective is we can't trust the political system to make the necessary interventions. And it's going to take a much stronger grassroots and organizational process to get people together to try and stop these negative trajectories. And, I could say a lot more about all of that stuff. For example, just to not go into too much detail, we live in a an economy based on infinite economic growth. It's not a decision to have economic growth. It's what the system requires with a range of mechanisms, again, I'm not going to go into. How do you have a system of economic growth that is perpetual and infinite, that gains by using more and more of the Earth's resources, cycling through, buy and throw away, buy and throw away? How does that work on a finite planet? At what point does that reach a point of no return where we have destroyed and conquered everything and we're left basically with, the shell of a planet or the shell of a habitat? Obviously, the outcome will be our own destruction. So that's one mechanism to consider that, can't exist. So that's part of the issue.
Yeah, and there's just so many issues with it. I think one of the main sort of features, I think, too, of the current system, my understanding as well of your criticism of it, is that it's centered around debt. And I guess for those who might not understand what debt is, can you explain that and how we have a system where essentially money is created out of debt?
Yeah. So the subject of debt is an enormous one. It goes back 5,000 years and has undergone a number of revisions in study, in anthropological study. But what we know is that debt and credit, which are basically the same thing, actually preceded the widespread use of money when it came to market or exchange behavior. Communities tracked their liabilities, and you had reciprocal obligation. You had these ledgers, you had tally sticks, and all these other early mechanisms. These were transaction methods. There's also a bizarre religious component to it. There's a man named David Graeber who's done some excellent work on this. I recommend the book Debt, the First 5,000 Years. But I would summarize the issue by saying this: amazingly and catastrophically, somehow we now have a system where money is literally created out of debt. And again, it links back to this early period. It evolves since to where we are today. Why is actually quite perplexing, but this is where we are today in this very bizarre outcome. And for there to be money, there must be debt. I want everyone to think about this. If you have $1 trillion in existence, there must be $1 trillion of debt. Someone might have the value of that money in their bank account. Someone else might have all the debt at a bank with their liability ledger. And that is truly outstanding. And it means that it's impossible for the world to ever be out of debt. Money to exist requires debt. You think about debt slavery historically. Debt slavery is, of course, something we think is long gone by United Nations standards. There's more slaves in the world today than any time in human history, as far as absolute numbers. And historically speaking, even though, well, I should say, there is plenty of debt slavery happening still today, but nothing like the abject, say, Egyptian debt slavery. The difference today, ultimately, is that the perpetuation of this unresolvable debt serves as a coercive force to get people to submit to reduced wages due to their desperation, effectively guaranteeing a cheaper labor force for the corporate architecture to exploit. So instead of being having one slave owner, we are slaves to the entire system because it's the lower and middle classes that hold the majority of the debt. They are the ones that make the money, so to speak, through their mortgages and their loans, and then that money trickles up to the rich and the billionaire class and the ownership class, and we're stuck with the liability. Hence, we are great to exploit because we're all desperate. And by the way, I'm not saying there's a conspiracy here. This is just what the system does and how it's evolved in the structure that we see. And again, it's truly mind-numbing when you think about it. That's one other thing I wanted to say about this. Yes, of course, the interest charges. Now, not only is it bad enough that you have perpetual debt, because for there to be money, there has to be debt. But in the profit system, you mark up a good, you put it on a shelf, and it costs $3 to make. You charge $4 for it because you need to make a profit. Well, the banking system does the same thing, but it makes the money. So what does it do? It charges interest, which means that it wants more money back, but yet the system hasn't actually created that money. So literally, it's impossible to pay back the interest charges that are put into the system, creating even more downward pressure. So you can pay back the principal, but the outstanding interest is always floating around society. There are ways it goes away through collapses and jubilees and backroom negotiations between governments and so on, but it's still a fundamental feature of the system. And that is particularly insidious, and not only for individuals in the lower class and such, but also poor countries. I mean, look at these structural adjustment policies done with the IMF and the World Bank. These non-sovereign countries that don't make their own money, they're reliant on other central banks, and they're just perpetually screwed, for lack of a better word. And it's inevitable. It's like a game of musical chairs. It's inevitable that these countries will fail, just like it's inevitable that people will go bankrupt because of this very system.
And for those who don't know, we are about $300 trillion in debt estimated globally. And I think we've touched on it here that basically it seems like the system somehow functions, but it seems also kind of counterintuitive for how it could function with this amount of debt in circulation. So I guess to just quickly summarize, like, how is it possible that it is functioning? Is it because of those mechanisms you talked about where countries find ways of being able to sort of redistribute the money somehow and still have those interest rates? But how can it possibly function with that much money in debt?
As touched upon before, it's impossible for there to be equal or less debt in the system than there is money due to the use of interest charges particularly. There's about $80 trillion in actual currency, and then there's about 300 plus trillion in debt. And I think those numbers have changed a little bit because we've had contractions in the money supply globally. As far as how it's possible, that's a good question, and it's more of a time game. It's basically what's called the velocity of money. It masks the issue. Money is moving around. It's constantly changing hands so fast that it allows people in this pocket to resolve the debts here and there, back and forth. We can resolve debt here. We move the debt basically around between people, not literally, but basically the debt is always there, but it keeps getting transferred. And as long as you move it around fast enough, it gives the illusion and it buys you time. And of course, refinancing it just, so, eventually you're going to have a collapse. It's inevitable, whether it's a grand collapse or it is a domino effect that happens, which is usually the case. Most central banks are aware of this phenomenon. And it's unfortunate, too, because at least back in the day, in the religious connotation of this, they had debt jubilees. They actually realized intuitively that this is a problem, and they just forgave debt periodically. You very rarely see that anymore. That used to be a thing. And that's, frankly, if they want to preserve the system, if the banking system and governments want to preserve this system at all, they need to start doing that, even though the whole system is completely unviable, because that shouldn't happen, obviously. There's no equilibrium there. It's insane.
It is insane. I'll touch on like that concept of the equilibrium later, but to go back to your criticism of the current system in terms of creating social division and classism. And I know it's also got other problems such as ecological collapse and environmental damage. And I wanted to ask, can you explain how competitive market dynamics work to create these features?
Sure. So competitive market dynamics are complex and they exist on many levels and areas in the system. They interweave, there's different scales. For those familiar with, say, economic feedback relationships in system dynamics, it's like you pull a lever on one side of the machine and there's a chain reaction that triggers another lever and that moves through the system. Competitive dynamics have this chain reaction, which affect, again, both sustainability issues for the environment, which is probably the most critical of this, and of course, socioeconomic inequality issues, exacerbating both of them. Basically, we have an economic model that creates antagonism between everything. When two people apply for the same job, their skill sets are competing against each other for that scarce employment. When business in a given sector produces the same general goods seeking market share, they're competing against each other and they tweak their goods with planned obsolescence and creating new little elements to make people feel more enticed to have their utility satisfied. And of course, what does that lead to? It leads to extreme waste. What would happen if these companies just collaborated? They took consensus, they had feedback from the community, and didn't just randomly output different good features and actually, engage the public. You'd have exponentially less waste. Even more broadly, and perhaps most dangerously, nation states are defined by their economic power, right? And there really hasn't been a war in history, if you really dig deep, that hasn't had some kind of core economic foundation. We talk about religious wars and the Crusades. There was an enormous property interest and all of that stuff as well. You look at modern conflicts today, and most of them, if not all of them, at least the ones that are large enough, have some kind of strong economic motivation on one level or another, or they're rooted in such deprivation because of economic circumstances, it erupts in some kind of tribal, horrible, conflict. And beyond that, if you look even deeper with the issue, in the nature of the system, because it's based on infinite growth and consumption, once again, you realize that this system, capitalism, is actually at war with the habitat itself. It's at war with the very basis of our entire evolution and existence because it's so utterly incompatible. And you even feel that. You look at conservative mindsets out there, they just want to disregard the environment. They disregard the news about anything related to what could infringe upon business freedom, right? Oh, we want more growth. Oh, and I've even heard people say that, things like climate change is just some kind of leftist conspiracy to want to, this is ridiculous, of course, but some kind of leftist conspiracy to want to bring in a socialist government and remove the freedoms of the market. That's how this, it seems ridiculous again, but it's that people think this way. It's not that far-fetched for people in this culture to think that way, that are acclimated into this kind of business cult mentality. So ultimately, there's nothing in the economic structure that supports sustainability. Let's be very clear about that. In fact, it supports the exact opposite by system force. True efficiency, true sustainability, and true conservation, which are probably the most core values our species can have and methods to ensure generational sustainability, is the opposite incentive structure, amazingly, to keep market capitalism functioning. Direct dichotomy. So we're at war with nature itself due to the very structure of the economy, and needless to say, nature is going to win that battle in the end. Now, and one final point, the sociology is distorting too. I would frankly, personally, and many disagree, go so far to say that competition is just a general sickness when it comes to culture, such as people's obsession with group identity and sports. This cultural obsession people have with winning and beating others and their teams. It all feeds into this terrible, destructive pattern. And there's nothing healthy about it as far as I'm concerned. Some will argue, obviously people can enjoy sports, but it becomes different when you put it on a screen and you have your bread and circuses and you're basically imitating business in this kind of recreation, and it feeds back into this kind of vile of aggression to want to dominate people and conquer things in business and so on and so on. And if, of course, you ask traditional economists about the role of competition, what do they say? Pretty much the only thing they can say. They say, oh, this is what we need to generate innovation. However, it's never specified what this innovation is supposed to mean, right? Innovation to do what? Create more munitions, to to innovate more single-use throwaway goods through planned obsolescence, to innovate people to be more addicted to social media or alcohol or drugs, and the horrible persuasions of advertising which brainwash people on a daily basis. This old idea that we compete for the sake of innovation and progress is probably the most frustrating, because no one ever asked the question of innovation to what end. And what you find is that really innovation within capitalism is not innovation. It's just a wasteful form of seeking market share, completely misguided, done for all the wrong reasons, the wrong incentives. People innovate for selfish, profit-seeking reasons first and foremost, rather than trying to innovate to solve problems. So, not to mention how insulting it is to think humans can't innovate without competition. I mean, think about how insulting that is. Oh, you're never going to be incentivized to do something positive or creative, so we're going to have to force you through coercion and debt and all these pressures that have been manufactured so you can think of something new to sell, basically, to somebody else, really, is what it is. So it's not a valid defense for a competitive economy. And I'll say this finally, competition should be the last resort of any civilized society, right? We're not primates in the wild fighting for fruit in a tree. Yet the very foundation of our economy assumes that we are. We literally take competition as the first step, when really it should be the last resort. So.
Thank you. And that's interesting, because it ties into my next question of how the market economy actually behaves. And I think I remember listening to one of your podcasts, and you gave an analogy of how it's a machine with an output pipe on each end. And like on one side, it produces the food, goods, and things that help people, live their lives better. And on the other side, it's got the exhaust and pollution and market externalities. And I would say that it sounds like these are the negative market externalities on the other side. I think it's a really good analogy. And I just wanted to ask if you can explain what negative market externalities are to people who don't understand. And do you think that basically the bad side in this equation outweighs the good?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That has been the unfortunate adaptation of this system as an evolution, as we've moved from very simplistic, handcraft mechanisms of economy to the incredibly complex, advanced, digitalized world we see today, where people are actually losing understanding of what is even happening. And that's for another conversation. With the introduction of such complexity, we don't really even know what's going to happen economically. It's so insanely complicated what we've done through the network of markets, especially with the advent of AI, which businesses are going to throw into the mix as impulsively as possible if they think it can improve their bottom line. We're going to have even more complexity. It's bad enough most economists today don't even predict. They can't predict anything. They claim they understand how the system works, but they can't predict anything. So that is the evolution. Today, we are absolutely destroying things far more rapidly than we can fix them through the same market mechanisms. So negative market externalities describe costs or outcomes that are not built into the price of a given good or service. A very simple example would be someone spending $5 a day on a pack of cigarettes, smoking for many years, and then one day they get lung cancer, which has a good probability for many people. And the costs of those medical costs obviously are not included in the money they spent on those cigarettes. So that's one example. A more common example that we hear in the public sphere has to do with the hydrocarbon industry, constantly polluting the world through leaks and spills and all sorts of public health and environmental effects downstream. And yet none of those costs are built into the original price of the hydrocarbon products that are made and sold. Hence, they are externalized costs in that sense. Interestingly, and this is, I think, very interesting, in fact, studies have been done that look at these downstream kind of natural capital, negative market externality effects of the most dominant industries in the world, the industries that we all have to share. They're most dominant, life-supporting industries that keep infrastructure going and everything. And these studies have concluded that when you account for these negative market externalities, none of these industries are actually profitable. And what that implies is that the entire capitalist business architecture globally is not even profitable in and of itself when it comes to accounting for what it's doing to the natural world externally in monetary terms. And that is quite the revelation, because what it really means is that capitalism is a horrible business on its own terms. So if you take it on its own terms, when you think about business efficiency and what defines business success, and you see it in the profitability of this company against this company, but when you take the whole thing and you compare it against the real world, the real natural world, and you put a price tag on the natural world, like capitalism likes to do, it actually fails on its own merits. And I think that's a very important thing for people to think about. As far as that analogy of the machine producing goods on one side and pollution on the other, if you listen to people like Bill Gates, who's a classic capitalist apologist, he loves to say technology is the solution. Well, we just got to keep innovating once again, and we're going to be able to solve climate change. We'll figure it out. We're not going to change the system. We're just going to find ways to fix it and intervene, of course, with the classic approach. And that's clearly not going to happen. And it's like there's a tornado moving through a city, and behind the tornado is a real-time construction crew, and they're trying to constantly rebuild everything the tornado is destroying until the tornado turns around and starts destroying everything again, and then they go and they rebuild it again, assuming they can keep up with the tornado in real time. That is basically what we're doing right now in our attempt to solve the exponentially increasing problems that we are seeing, particularly on the environmental front. So, needless to say, you can't solve a problem by simply trying to repair damage it creates. You have to get to the root. And I'll conclude by saying capitalism has reached a new level of adaptation once again, where it is now little more than a vehicle of civilization's destruction. That is, in system dynamics terms, the function at this point. Get rid of what people say, get rid of any theory, get rid of just all the postulations of traditional economists over the years, and look at what it's doing. The whole thing about system dynamics, when you take the perspective of a non-economic perspective, but a system analysis perspective that you find in natural science, you realize that the system can only be defined by what it does. And this is an important distinction, because if you get into debates with economists, they say, well, this is what the system's supposed to do. We can kind of see how it does this. Step back, get rid of all that stuff, and look at what is actually happening. A system can only be defined by what it actually does. And the purpose of the system now is basically to kill us off. And we are allowing that to happen because we're not understanding the actual dynamics. We have a whole global population of people that more or less mean well, and they're producing outcomes. We are all collectively producing outcomes, destructive outcomes that none of us even intend, right? That's profound, and that defies our sense of intuition, and that it explains a lot. So you have to take a very objective look through the lens of system dynamics to really understand what's going on. And at the end of this, I'll recommend some books that people can read to look into that.
And this ties into that. So, a lot of people say that the reason we have the wealth and income gaps and the poor, living in the conditions that they are between each other, and they attribute it to greed, and that is just a natural part of being a human, that we have greed. And it kind of sounds like what you're pointing at here is that this isn't just because people are built this way, it's because the system has geared us towards being like this, and even people with the best meaning intentions end up playing into it because it's part of the nature of how the system works. So I guess if you can answer, is this the main reason? Could you say greed is an attributing factor or not?
It's a subjective concept, and I'd say all of this works on multiple levels. First, you have this sort of neoclassical economic theory that some may be familiar with, of so-called rational agents. And we're all supposed to be rational, informed agents. And one of the modus operandi of us when it comes to market trade in our pursuit of utility is we seek to self-maximize, they call it. We're self-maximizing rational agents. And basically what this means is that if you're going to be a smart, competitive agent, you take advantage of every opportunity you can to the highest extreme you can within legal bounds, at least to whatever degree we can measure that, to extract the most out of every single transaction. For example, people complain in the US about the pharmaceutical industry and the drug prices. And they often will use that word greed when they see these markups, when they see billionaire CEOs and the incredible profit of these companies that are basically making money off of sick people, right? Yet the business community is doing exactly what it's expected of them, including the pharmaceutical industry, to meet the interest of their shareholders, not to mention just the basic ethic, once again, of self-maximization, which is a competitive function. If somebody with diabetes is willing to pay 4 or 5 times the amount for that drug, which if their life depends on it, they certainly will, and you can get away with it without too much public upheaval, You will work to get away with it, morality aside. That is business acumen, and that is what makes billionaires. So there's that. But more generally, since the social system really, globally there's different variations, but there really isn't a universal social support structure. Everything is entrenched in fear. Everyone is insecure because you don't know what's going to happen. Someone loses their job, they're living paycheck to paycheck. And that translates once again into that kind of so-called greedy behavior because you want to maximize once again for the sake of your future security. If you have the opportunity to strategically exploit for more money, you can rationalize that by saying, well, I'm not sure how much money I'm going to have in the future 10 years from now, so I better push for as much as I can now. I'm going to really mark up my house, or I'm going to put, do something manipulative just within the bounds of my moral threshold, even though it's wrong and deceitful. But hey, this is what the game is, and so on. It's easy to rationalize those things. If you have children, you could do the exact same thing. Well, I might have $1 million in the bank, but well, my kids, they live in this society. I want to make sure they are taken care of. I love my kids and my grandkids, so I need $10 million more to take care of them. So there's that. It's an ongoing rationalization process. And then you have the cultural or social status problem, where people see financial accomplishment and material possessions as a form of communication to show others they are valuable, they're successful, they're worthy, they work hard, they're accomplished. So, nobody buys like a 50-room mansion or a $50 million yacht because they just want to ride around alone in it and have no one look at it. It's a kind of conspicuous consumption, ultimately for the sake of social status and acclaim, a form, again, of social communication, a deeply distorted and neurotic sickness, to be sure. I mean, think about it. Who's more confident in this scenario? A person living minimally that doesn't require much material possession to be happy. They're social, they have family, they have good bonds, they're loved, they feel love, they express love. Or the person with such insecurity, obviously, they have to have $1 million mansions and wealth and ridiculous high-priced cars. Naturally, the more secure person, the more confident person, the more stable and the more healthy person is the one that chooses minimalism, which of course aligns with nature as well. And that's another thing about that as an aside. You can't have that kind of value system on a finite planet with an expanding species. The idea you can just infinitely have as much as you want, that the fact that anyone even has to point that out, blows my mind. Like, where do people think they are in this infinite material wants reality? And I've actually had debates with people that argue, oh, would people naturally have infinite wants? Well, if that's the case, then we should just kill ourselves right now, because there's no way you can sustain a species if that's the value system. And obviously that's untrue. So, while I understand once again this word greed, as we've touched upon, greed is really just an empty word denoting insecurity, along with the fundamental business acumen incentive of self-maximization in the competitive arena at every turn.
And I think a lot of apologists for the way the system works, and even though it sounds dysfunctional, is they come up with the concept of equilibrium theory, which I think we sort of briefly touched on before. Can you explain what that means in terms of market economics, or if it's possible to have a self-regulating market, as some other proponents of this model say?
That's an excellent question. It really gets to the heart of this whole debate and dilemma around markets and what has really become a kind of religion. The answer, of course, is no. The great myth in this endless academic and again, somewhat religious debate that this system of markets is magical. It's like the universe, it's the spheres, everything's in order. We don't have to do anything. It's viable. It self-regulates. And as we all are probably familiar with somewhere in our college or high school studies, the great Adam Smith, who we'll touch upon a little bit later, put forward this vague notion of the invisible hand. And that little kernel seed really took fruit and grew into this horrible, malign forest where there's this ongoing pursuit. Basically, it's a utopian pursuit of some kind of perfect economic science. It's these economists that really want to believe they're physicists. They want to believe they're dealing with something of true natural origin, and they can see the dynamics, and it's built into nature, not our creation. This is nature. And the idea being, of course, that we don't need any intervention or regulation, as if the free market can be really free, and therefore, through trade and competition and supply and demand, everything will work out for everyone, and that's all we have to do. And if we're doing anything wrong, it's intervention itself. We can't let government come in and mess up our perfect sphere utopian economic thing. So it's interesting because this mythology is as present as this mythology is, if you actually read microeconomics and actually look at what's happened over the past, say, 50 years, no one actually argues this is the case. The myth has grown so large, and there are certainly schools that support it. In fact, it's dominant in these schools, but deep down, they're really all in denial of what mathematicians and truly objective market economists have figured out, that it does not self-regulate. You have to intervene. Again, the debates go back and forth. It's probably the ultimate debate. It's probably the one that comes up the most in my own general communication with people on social media and beyond. They say, no, no, no. The reason you have all this unemployment, the reason, it's the Fed intervening. It's all the state subsidies. They not only do they not understand the dynamics, they're just tacitly, not even tacitly, they're openly rejecting the idea that there are any endogenous flaws to the system. And the best you'll get is from someone like Warren Buffett. They'll say, well, we need a little bit of regulation, but not too much. Can't have too much because, that's going to, again, interfere with their religion. Because if they don't have that market self-regulation, what do they have? They have a disparate, dysfunctional system that basically is unviable, and therefore the whole philosophy of their existence and their foundation and their wealth is destroyed. Intervention is heretical, and we see this again all major economic schools even to this day. And I would just reinforce the fact that it's kind of a religious denialism, this utopian ideal that if the market's free, everything will be great. Again, going back to system science, there's something called viability. I've used this word a few times to define that. A viable system is something that doesn't require any administration. One of the very early mechanics in the steam engine industrial revolution, and they had a steam engine which was very unstable, so they created what's called a Watt's governor. It's a thing that they put on the steam engine that regulates the flow of steam. So when the engine goes too fast, the governor modulates based on the feedback from what's happening in the engine, and it centers it out, kind of like a thermostat in your house. The core principle of viability in any system, whether in nature or in a social system, meaning man-made, is if you have to constantly interfere with it, the more you interfere with it, the more you administer it, the more you intervene in it, the less viable it is. It's like it's not made for that purpose, in other words. And as I implied earlier, this system is not made for human survival. It's not. It has functions like that have been somewhat reliable over the course of early history, but this system is a destructive system that's there to kill all of us. I'm not really being facetious here. This is what the system is doing, whether we choose to accept it or not, because it's that unviable. The only thing we can do to stop it from killing us is constantly trying to figure out how to intervene and stopping this and new regulations here. And of course, what happens with that, you have the sickness of the special interest cult, basically the true high priests that believe in this system so much, that are so rewarded by it in the high billionaire business ownership class, and they have all their tentacles into government so they can counteract that and sabotage intervention and any attempt to make balance when they want to, which is precisely what's happening, which once again is why I have no faith in the system as we see it. You can't separate now the power of money from the system. People complain about money in politics. This is a big theme here in the United States. Well, at what point is that a contradiction? If you can go out and buy donuts and buy insurance policies and buy a house, why can't you buy policy? It's a complete contradiction to think that money is not going to. In fact, if you want to be consistent in the system, yeah, you use money to pay for and buy everything. You use competitive dynamics to pay and buy for, do everything, influence everything. And pretty much that's what's happening. Granted, we stop it a little bit, and we have to because it's going to kill us. But you see my point, though. It's one integrated system as an aside. So today we have an economic system that is so incredibly unviable that if you just let the machine run on its own without any corrective intervention, like a car, it's just going to continue running right off the road and crash into a tree, gesturally speaking.
And so when we just touched there about economists like Adam Smith, so they came up with a very strong model for saying that this is how capitalism works, and a lot of people describe them as being, having these great models that are very useful, and this is why we have capitalism functioning the way it does. But I would ask, are there models impractical and just more theoretical and probably didn't really work in practice? Or do you think that it's just the nature of how we've got to this point now, that it's kind of capitalism has grown on its own to become this machine of its own?
Yeah, the kernel seed was always there in the very advent of trade. As abstract and strange as it might sound to people unfamiliar with this line of thinking, trade is the problem. It's all based around these dynamics of trade. The moment you have a trading society, everything we see, the property relationships, because you have to have property with trade, you has a self-evident generation of what the model or the system is going to be. But going back to Adam Smith particularly, he didn't really have a model. Just to be really accurate here, when we talk about a model, it's literally basically math. It says we're going to define the properties of this system, we're going to model it, and we're going to run equations, and we can actually simulate this. That's what economic modelists, is that a word? That's what economic model people do. Adam Smith didn't really do that. What Adam Smith did, and he was quite brilliant, is give a kind of a presumed foundation for it. He had certain principles he took from John Locke. He reincorporated them and said, well, here's the philosophy of this system. Here's the way we think it's going to work. Here are the attributes that we can identify. Adam Smith, followed by David Ricardo and some others in what's called the classical school of economy. Karl Marx, believe it or not, was a classical economist too, because they actually believed in value relationships based on labor and resources, which were thrown out the window when the modern school came along called neoclassical, which reduced everything down to simply what people are willing to pay for. They call it utility. Utilitarian theory says the only thing that gives something value is what you decide it does. And there's some value to that, but it's also an extreme deviation from anything that you could link to the natural world. At least Adam Smith, recognized that labor produces things. There are natural resources, and there has to be value placed upon that. The new school, the neoclassicals, rejected all that. There's no, labor has no value than what's perceived. And of course, the earth is literally an abstraction. There's no value whatsoever. I mean, clearly, intuitively, these people know they have to get resources. They know it's scarce, but the models put forward do not account for that whatsoever. To his credit, by comparison, I'll say, Adam Smith was actually probably smarter than most of the economists we have today because he at least had that attribute. And he also said that you can't have full self-regulation, and that's the biggest part of this. He recognized that, like wages, people in this neoclassical school, they think that wages and what CEOs make are determined by market dynamics, as if there's a push and pull, self-regulation. Oh, you just punch all this into a computer and here's what this CEO is going to be paid because of their industry, and they assume these dynamics, but it's not. Wages are set by social custom. People have to decide. That's why you have minimum wage. At least governments figured that out intuitively. You can't not have minimum wage because if you let the system do what it does, it would never be able to balance out what people get paid at a minimum. You'd have people making 10 cents an hour today. You literally would if you didn't have those wage elements because of the pressures and competitive nature of the system. So to his credit, once again, he at least, had those fundamental foresights that you need a mixed economy, so to speak. Granted, I don't think there's value to that because the economy itself is so powerful, the root of survival being what it is. It has overridden our ability to create that mixed reality where there's balance because intervention is sabotaged perpetually. So Adam Smith, he gets a lot of flack because of his introduction of the invisible hand, and he really did set in motion a pretty nasty chain reaction with that. But if you read him, he really was on the side of the worker and the average person. He loathed the rich. Like if Adam Smith knew, people like Warren Buffett existed that literally has made billions of dollars just by gambling, because that's all Warren Buffett does. He doesn't create anything, he just gambles, and he's considered like this pioneer of, capitalist success. Adam Smith would puke in his soup. He would be horrified by the fact that we have this Wall Street, adaptation that has nothing to do with creation. So
it's a good distinction to make. I don't think people would know that. I didn't really. So I guess if the current economic system is flawed by the things we have discussed, is there any alternative? I know this is a big question, and many do think that communism or socialism is the only alternative. And I know that you don't necessarily advocate for those systems specifically, and it's kind of, for me, I even think that it's sad that that's the only alternative that people know of. So that's why I would like to ask if there is any alternative that you would like to propose.
Well, of course. Stepping back, let's be clear on this common misconception. Communism or socialism, they're not systems. They have no features of a system that are self-defining. They are simply administered, or they were or could be administered bureaucracies with no shared structure. When one country imposes so-called socialistic practices and another country does the same, most likely, and as is often the case, they're very, very different in how they're organized and how power is distributed and how information flows work and so on. And there's certainly no feedback relationship that even is comparable to what markets do. So markets are, in fact, a system, a very dysfunctional one that leads a certain direction that is not what people want, but they don't understand it. Socialism and communism are not systems. They're just ideas, basically. They're basically reactions to capitalism that say, well, we should have some kind of democratic economy. And of course, I agree with that. In principle, in the most fundamental notion of socialism, meaning public ownership of the means of production, that is a viable concept. I mean, we have democracy throughout the world. Everyone clamors for some kind of general participation, decision making, except they stop right at the economy. The economy is, in capitalism, is the only thing that's purely dictatorial. There's no involvement. It's just private enterprise dictatorships. So just make sure people understand that these are not systems. As far as actual solutions, it's interesting people bring that up because they don't, not you, of course, people just sort of feel confused, and all they really have to do is look to nature. What are other organisms doing? What are the defining characteristics of species that have been around for millennia? It's about balance. It's about dynamic equilibrium. We have to first come up with some kind of central tenets, right? So principles of sustainability. At a minimum, you can be contrasting to what we're doing now. So, for example, instead of a economy based on consumption and growth, and infinitely so, where it's best for the economy to purchase and throw away and buy and consume and keep that going, keep the machine going of cyclical consumption so people have jobs. Well, clearly that is not in line with nature because we're just eradicating our resources. So we want to have dynamic equilibrium. We don't want to cut down a forest that can't be regenerated in the same amount of time. And once you start thinking that way, and that kind of train of thought, the fundamental parameters of a sustainable economy become self-evident in their principles. And then in terms of building a system, those feedback relationships become inherent, and then you're reliant upon what you can do with the given state of technology and resources. Really, it's just an issue of looking at what's happening with sustainable species and the most fundamental sustainability protocols that are required. We have existed like that in the past. You go back to hunter-gatherer societies. They existed off of nature. They didn't have the ability to interfere yet. So what did they do? They hunted and they gathered, and they lived off of natural regeneration. They couldn't grow things at that point. And so they had to find that balance, and they felt a good conservatism. They felt in one with nature in many ways. When you look at the writings of indigenous cultures that are still kind of around from that period of time, that live in the Amazon and so forth, and carried over into other, first world peoples as well. So those philosophies are there, but it's just become deeply distorted. I have absolutely no doubt that we can rebuild a sustainable model, and people will be much happier inside of it. How we get there, of course, is a completely different conversation.
And I was going to actually ask that. So, if we could find an alternative that was based on sustainability, cooperation, and human need as being the key values, what would be required to bring such a thing into reality? I think, would you say that value systems and culture behaviors need to also shift alongside this?
Yes, which brings up a very complicated situation. The question of which comes first, system change or value change. And it's one of those really difficult things to talk about, especially given the ignorance and the way people think about themselves, because most people assume, as does the criminal justice system and everything else, that we are the singular point of all of our actions and all of our beliefs that lead to those actions and so forth. There's this fundamental ignorance there, and it pollutes people's sense of ego, and it pollutes their sense of identity to think that they are somehow out of control. And of course, none of us are really in control. We're all in this cycle of influence because of our culture, because of our biology, because of all the daily pressures, because of our traumas. I mean, there's so many things that navigate behavior, but that's a deeper conversation. But in terms of systems, obviously, if you're in an environment and it has certain incentives, and it's survival incentives, you're going to acclimate to those behaviors because that's just what you do as a surviving organism. And if those incentives are good and positive and social and communal and oriented, and they about good public health and respecting people, then we will evolve in that way. If it's not like we have today, well, where you're cutthroat, where you're competitive, where you actually, most people, they thrive on abuse of others, whether they know it or not. And when you take advantage of a situation financially, you're basically abusing somebody. You're taking away something of their sustenance and sustainability. But we don't see it that way. It's considered, look at Donald Trump. He's the perfect amalgamation of that kind of competitive neuroses, where he thrives on the idea of beating others. And that's unfortunately the dominant value structure that we see across the world. So what comes first? Obviously it has to all kind of happen simultaneously. Education's important. Are the arts and film and music and media, things I've all been a part of, media festivals and stuff in the past. I see the power in that, but over the years I've realized that we have to start building new environments. You see it in little pockets, from even minimalist things like Burning Man to certain small pockets of communities like the kibbutzim in Israel to, even indigenous relationships. There's certain push and pull where people are kind of realizing they need to be, identify with nature and respectful of each other and realize we all share the earth and all that fun stuff. But of course, the system doesn't reward it. So, as I'm going to talk about in my new film and in future works, as I've talked about on my podcast, I'm really working hard to come up with a preliminary infrastructure that can be scaled out, that gets people off the grid, first in a very minimalistic way, and then hopefully, again, being scaled out where people can start to coexist with the existing system, but live in a different system as far as their practices and values. It's a very tricky thing to do. I don't believe in communes and things like that. I think that's more escapist. We have to do something that's inclusive, that lures people in. It's nothing new. It's the build it and they will come phenomenon, or what Buckminster Fuller talked about. You have to really start to recreate, not complain. Easier said than done, obviously, especially when you're trying to create something that's not just, say, a minimal practice like a tool library or a time bank, or something semi off the grid as far as capitalist values and so on. Got to be integrated. It has to be efficient. It's something we all need to start putting our heads together and thinking about. And unfortunately, very few people are doing that, which is something we can talk about in a moment as well.
Yeah, I think it's incredible to think that we could do this if we all just actually worked actively together. And I guess, yeah, that does tie into my point that do you think that identitarianism, if I can call it that, like the idea of groupthink and siding with just a majority simply because you identify with that group, do you think that sort of thinking gets in the way of creating the real social, environmental, and systemic change that we've talked about and we so desperately need?
Absolutely. It's probably one of my biggest grievances when I look at patterns of culture, group identity, and social conformity. Probably the greatest inhibition when it comes to change or any kind of awakening, so to speak, breaking people out of their patterns. People are deeply locked into their tribes. I think a lot of the most extreme, subcultures are basically locked into a social relation rather than anything else. You look at you look at like people that believe the earth is flat, this rather adorable subculture. They're actually really just doing it for the community involvement, I think, deep down. I don't think they really care if the earth is flat or not. They just love what it does in their sense of superiority and their sense of feeling they know something somebody else does, and they get together in the little conferences. So it's really unfortunate. And you can just look to religion, of course, too, to see the same kind of pattern. People are just refused to move beyond what they think their identity is because it destroys who they are. If they really believe these things over their lifetime, then someone contradicts it, and most people can't handle that kind of emotional pain. I'll say that in general, we like to think we're rational people, but most people are not really rational. They just think in relationship to how their thoughts are perceived by others. You probably are familiar with the Asch conformity experiment, but they put up these lines and they ask a one test subject in a controlled setting where everyone else is actors to say which line is longer. The other actors are giving incorrect answers, and then once they get to the final real subject, he more often than not will agree with the others, even though it's completely obvious with his own eyes that the line is not what they're saying it is. So we have to contend with that. That's probably one of the biggest inhibitions, and I don't know the answer. It's a kind of evolutionary baggage, I think. I think early on in our species, the need for really serious group identity served the function of the species. But at this point in time, as again, the complex social arrangement, the adaptive system that we are as a species, it's perverted. And now we're stuck with this baggage, and it's probably epigenetically related to us on some level, but really I think it's mostly culturally reinforced. I mean, think about it. If you go against the grain, and there's many repercussions to that. You could lose your job, especially on the internet. I mean, internet doesn't forget. So if you do something to make yourself look foolish, or you don't want to rock the boat, you're going to be exposed for whatever you're expressing, and that has a lot of unfortunate repercussions. And people, of course, are very intolerant. I mean, look at cancel culture and all that kind of stuff. People are terrified of rocking the boat, probably more than ever, because their fear of what's going to happen in retribution from the general social environment. In racism, like racism is a group dynamic. It has its origins in economics. I wish more people understood that. Something Dr. Martin Luther King talked about a great deal. because he never took the position that racism was just, some kind of genetic disposition or fear of someone that doesn't look like you. Those patterns actually aren't out there. They're not universal anyway. There might be something to be said for running into something you've never seen before, but that's not prevalent in terms of why racism persisted. Racism, especially in like American culture, is an outcome of economic scarcity and the abuse of one culture that was brought into another culture. And then suddenly they wanted to fight for resources and jobs. Racism became a legal thing. It was legally decreed. That race comes from a legal distinction that said, well, this person's black and you're white, therefore here's the divide. And all the things we see now to this day that are so perverted and deeply entrenched, and they don't even realize the source of it. They don't realize it's rooted in economic fear. So, it's just another example of this outcome of group dynamics. But I will say the competitive nature of our economy and the way we've organized it is at the root of pretty much all the division that we see. And it's truly tragic.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I wanted to ask, so do you think there are any groups that are maybe currently tackling economic problems, environmental decline, or systemic issues in this way? And are they doing it successfully if they are, or is it even possible to under the current system?
Well, yeah, it depends on the level of engagement and what your measurement is. I would never put down anyone or any group seeking a better world, regardless of what they're doing, but we can qualify the efficacy of their actions, especially if they're not really rooted in understanding the structure of this system. If you're trying to shut down pollution industries and you're successful at doing that for a little while, well, that's contributing to something, even though another one's just going to pop right up because the system is producing these things. All of the agents, so to speak, are all temporal. They're fleeting. They're just cancerous growths that will keep coming back because the cancer itself has not been treated. I have friends, for example, in Greenpeace and whatnot, and I often ask, like, well, so what if you're understanding the environmental problem and you're realize that there are systemic problems and so on, why doesn't Greenpeace, with all of its resources and millions of dollars, try to build a kind of creative design think tank? That's really what needs to happen. There's no institution out there that I'm aware of, aside from just kind of theoretical ones like the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and they touch upon things, but they're not really holistically, systemically oriented. I'm really not aware of one, frankly, at least one that's active. It's easy to theorize this stuff, but as far as people that are actually working to get to the bottom of this and building new systems and communicating the information that's most important, that all of this is endogenous and that we can't keep throwing patches on things and holding up signs and is, protesting has its effect, but it's all temporal. Again, the true disease is underlying it. So yeah, it's disappointing. There are groups doing many good things, but I don't know of any particular group really that is doing what needs to be done in terms of economic redesign.
So that sounds to me, if anyone's listening, that there's a need for this, and there's definitely a gap here. And I would hope that maybe we can start gathering people who want to do something about this and see that there is a systemic problem. So I guess finally, are there any resources or websites that you'd like to share where people can go to learn more about these sorts of topics that we've talked about today?
I think the most important lens to learn about all this stuff is through, again, system dynamics. It sounds like a very abstract, academic concept. It began in the early 20th century with a man named Jay Forrester, and he started to realize that there are these feedback processes that are existing in nature. And if you begin to understand those processes, you have a far more efficient understanding of what's actually happening and the problems therein and how to control them if need be. And of course, the outcomes, more representative to causality. So system science, system dynamics, there's also cybernetics, which is a subfield of that. Stafford Beer is a big influence of mine. He did all sorts of wonderful things in his time. So I recommend people looking into that as a foundation to understand what's happening in the world. Without that foundation, I don't think people can really understand it. It's basically understanding scientific causality, but there is a vocabulary that's been established by people that's very, very helpful in how we model the world. I mean, think about it. We're all modeling the world. That's basically what our brains do. You look at a cat, we see the cat, but really it's our mind has a model of a cat that says, well, that's a cat because of the features that I identify. And most people look at the world with the wrong model. They haven't been taught the right model or how to even think about models. So they see the world through mostly a political lens, and unfortunately, mostly through a group dynamic lens. Everyone blames other groups. I mean, that's pretty much what the whole political system is. That's what the entire conspiracy culture is. It's all about blaming other people and blaming dark forces and blaming, this CEO here or this hidden philanthropist here or whatnot. So systems thinking really gets to the bottom of that, and ultimately to realize that we are a causal effect in all of this. And if you can get rid of the hubris of your own sense of ego and identity and realize you're part of something and you're influenced by it, it's a very profound and even a spiritual revelation to show the interconnectedness. But I would recommend Donella Meadows as a preliminary person to research. Anyone can find her books on systems thinking. I think she has a beginner's guide to it. She also helped write a book that you might be familiar with in the 1970s called Limits to Growth, which was a MIT-generated book about what would happen many decades down the line if basically capitalism, business as usual, was allowed to continue to grow in the way that it does endogenously. And what we're seeing today with environmental collapse and all these other features were basically predicted by these folks in the 70s. So that's an excellent book to get as well, to realize that you can assume what's going to happen in the future once you see this. And all of my seemingly dark comments about this system designed to kill us actually don't sound as ridiculous when you start to understand it and look objectively at the system itself. And of course, my website's peterjoseph.info, and I did write a book called The New Human Rights Movement, if anyone cares to check that out as well. So.
And I will be sharing all of the resources that you just talked about on our website. So to anyone listening, just head over to the 4ZZZ website and you'll be able to get those resources there. And lastly, I'd just like to mention that Peter Joseph's latest film, InterReflections, will be screening at no cost on Saturday, 11th of March at 3:30 p.m. in the Brisbane Square Library by the Brisbane Movement Sustainability Group. So be sure to check that out. It's an incredible film. And lastly, thank you so much, Peter. This is an incredible interview. Really enjoyed speaking with you.
Oh, thank you, Anita. And I didn't realize you were showing InterReflections. I appreciate that.